Hello and welcome to Wednesdays with WV. This is episode number 13. My guest on this episode has always been a people's favorite. He's been elegant on and off the field. He's been eloquent behind the mic and he's enthralled the cricket fans across the world for a number of years as a commentator. All in all, he's been a class act in all his avatars. It's my pleasure to present to you the one and only David Gard. Hello, David, and a warm welcome to you.
Hi, nice to see you. Very nice to see you.
You've seen leadership methods across different generations. You've been a leader yourself. What did you make out of this Ben Stokes and Baz McCullum combo as leaders?
In my time, leadership, I've seen all sorts of people, some very good leaders, some very average leaders. I put myself probably somewhere in the middle. I had some principles which I adhered to as best I could over the sort of couple of years I was allegedly captain of England. But times are very different then, and times this last 12 months or so have been incredibly different now in terms of what you're alluding to. Stokes and McCullum, between them, they have, I guess, two of the most relaxed minds in international cricket at the moment. I mean, they're fiercely competitive, that much we know. But in terms of how they run a team, it seems that all those things we used to worry about, so the little bits and pieces, the taps on the shoulder, the little sort of quiet chats, the old rules, the old ways of playing Test cricket, they've all gone, and they've somehow managed to agree on a very relaxed setup where they back players. I mean, the great example, I guess, of this last 6 months or so is they've backed Zach Crawley, whose figures have not exactly set the world on fire. Who I have to say, as a watcher, I like the way Zach plays, but I just wish he would work out a way of staying at the crease longer, more often. But they've backed him throughout, so the failure is not a problem. In the good old days, in my days, if someone had 2 or 3 bad games, there was a tap on the shoulder and they were out. And it was as simple as that. You tried someone else until you found a combination. Now the McCullum-Stokes rule is, well, we back the 12 or 13 in the immediate squad. They get a game, come whatever happens. Win or lose, we'll back them. And it's a very good way of instilling a sort of background confidence. And of course, winning games, what we all know from way back is that if you're winning games, then things like confidence just make their own rules. You gain that confidence as individuals, you gain that confidence as a team, and the roller coaster goes the right way. In fact, it's less of a roller coaster, it's just a steady ascent, victory after victory. So they've done something very special. And for me, the fascinating thing will be to see what happens next.
What about the Buttler-Mott combination vis-a-vis Bass and Stokes?
Yeah, well, again, cricket throws at us conundrums left, right and centre, doesn't it? Because prior to the last 12 months or so, Owen Morgan had done something incredibly special with the England one-day team. That's one of the great stories. And Owen Morgan, I think, is one of the great leaders because he took a side that was out of date and not performing in that World Cup, whatever it is, 7 years ago or so. He took a side, he remolded it, he changed the culture, changed the spirit, led from the front, and they became world champions the first time in England. One would like to think England should have won a World Cup at some stage before 2019. They got close. 1992, I was there in Australia when they could well have beaten Pakistan, but didn't. But it took so long for an England team to win a World Cup. And Owen Morgan was very much instrumental in that, even though the winning margin was a whisker or two. Now, the change of captaincy there, Buttler is a different sort of character to Morgan. Buttler is one of the most impressive people you will see play cricket in the shorter forms of the game. There's a good argument to say he's the best in the world at short form cricket. I dare say there are probably a billion people in India might like to put other candidates forward for that title. But he's certainly up in the top 5. So he's an extremely accomplished one-day player, but captaincy has tested him. And the fact that the side has had to make various changes, that's always something which just disturbs the rhythm a little bit. So as we speak, the World T20 is coming to its final days and England are in that mix in the semi-finals. Now, again, they have the capability to win a T20 World Cup if they have 2 good days. But there again, there are three other sides saying the same thing.
When we talk of leadership, and if you're talking to an English cricketer, Mike Bradley has to be spoken about. Your thoughts on
Absolutely. Absolutely. Mike was my first captain. So at the age of 21, I made a debut for England in an ODI against Pakistan. And a few weeks later, I made a debut in test matches. Now, Mike was excellent for so many good reasons. I mean, first of all, the two captains I had when I started my career, Mike was one for England. Ray Illingworth, who had been a former England captain, was my captain at Leicestershire. Both of them had this phenomenal memory for players. You know, this is way before the days of people looking into a laptop, looking at video footage of each and every player you come up against and working out tactics. You know, it's way before matchups have been invented. But both men had that incredible ability to remember players, remember what they did well, remember what they did badly, and work out ways of getting people out. So they immediately had respect from each and every one of the people playing under them. Very different characters on the outside. Really was, you know, quietly spoken man, but very tough underneath it. Ray Illingworth was more so overtly tough and quite brusque with a lot of us at that Leicestershire team. But really had that lovely ability to say, just take you aside for a moment, 2 or 3 minutes of conversation, and his point was made in a nice, comforting way. I mean, for instance, as a very good example, when I started my test career, I got a 50 in my first innings at Edgbaston, and that seemed okay. I felt, you know, it was rather nice. It was, you know, it didn't feel too bad. A game later at Lords, both these games against Pakistan, got another 50 on the first morning, but played a horrendous shot, swept it, Iqbal Kazim, missed it, bowled back in the pavilion. Now, at this stage, Mike, this is 2 games into my test career, and I'm having a lot of fun, but not exactly, I could be doing better. And he just took me aside quietly and said, look, I hate to say this, but, test matches, believe it or not, are 5 days. And these lovely 50s you're making are already a very good start. We like the way you play, etc., etc. But you really got to think about making 50s into 100s. So the message was quietly but firmly put into my mind that, whatever I'd done before, county cricket had been fun, the runs had come, the England recognition had come. But actually, once you're part of a team, whether you're 21 years old or 28 years old or 30-something years old, then the job is to make those runs that help a team win games. So I got the message fair and square and started thinking about making 100s and bigger 100s. And that's, of course, what you have to do when you start playing international cricket. So that ability to deal with people, I think, was one of Mike's really, really special talents.
On the subject of leadership, let's deviate a little bit. Rishi Sunak, the new PM, has a lot on his plate, isn't he? Unsettled times, divided party ranks, sliding economy.
And the rest. Every day. Every day. If you're living in the UK at the moment, and I guess there are other places with worse problems, let's face it, but if you're living in the UK at the moment, every day there seems to be something else. Something to do with the government itself, something to do with the problems facing government. In terms of British politics over the last 12 months, where a lot seems to have happened, I was always in favour of Sunak over Truss, and I couldn't believe it when the nation, it's not the nation, a small number of people relatively in the Conservative Party decided that Liz Truss was the answer to all our problems. She had some good ideas, but the ideas were always going to be badly timed. I would have gone for Sunak then. I'm very happy that Sunak is our Prime Minister now, given the absolute lack of alternatives. And what I like about him is that in this first couple of weeks, he has spoken with what sounds like authority. Yes, there have been problems. Yes, the opposition, the Labour Party, have a million things they can throw at him, and they will continue to do so because they are desperate after so long for power. And what I don't like about politics is this adversarial thing that goes on, where rather than, one would hope that when a country and a world, let's face it, in crisis, you'd hope under those circumstances that there would be some sort of mechanism whereby 600 odd members of parliament could put aside for a moment or two the absolute party politics thing, whereby they're just determined to get into power and see if they can do any better. Whereas at a time like this, we need rather more cooperation and agreement on the right things to do. Because what I really can't stand about politics, it's all very well if someone makes a mistake, as it were, and the opposition climbs onto it and says, you've made a mistake. But whether you're picking governments, whether you're picking policies or picking cricket teams, trying to make changes, you've got to have in mind that the change you make will improve things. So if you're changing a cricket team, dropping someone, you've got to make sure, you've got to be confident that the man coming in is going to improve things. So Sunak has an awful lot of things on his plate, but I like the way he speaks. Yes, there are still problems, and the problems are not going to go away just because we like someone, and the way they speak. But I think he's been impressive so far, personally. I like the way he has maintained a certain, we say, calmness when so many things are thrown at him. But there are, let's face it, cricketers, some of them I know have gone into politics around the world in various countries, and we know exactly who we're talking about. Some have tried it in this country, normally failed in this country, because UK likes people appear to have a broader agenda. I mean, again, the other problem about politics, wherever you are, is that you need to know everything about everything. Otherwise, someone will attack you on something which you thought, well, why would I know about that, as it were? But you have to know everything about everything, at least in cricket. You're limited to knowing everything about cricket as a captain, or at least that's the expectation. And again, I would say this, actually, that one of the skills of leadership to me is this. I don't think there are very many people, there are hardly any people who could claim to know the answer to everything. So as a leader of a cricket team, leader of a government, you have to understand and listen. One of my great principles as a captain was trying to listen to players in my team to understand what they're thinking, good or bad, whether they're on my side or not on my side. I like to know what's going on, because of course the worst thing, and again, this applies to cricket, to politics, to business, whatever you're managing or leading, the worst thing is that undercurrent of dissatisfaction that we get sometimes in cricket teams, where 2 or 3 people go into a corner and start muttering dark things to each other. And the only person, the other people, the other team, the rest of the team doesn't know what's going on. The captain doesn't know what's going on. So that communication thing, allowing people to speak freely, I think is a very, very important thing.
Yes, it is. And back to you again. 2 words, lazy elegance. Did it annoy you, irritate you, or you gotten used to them over a period of time?
Are those not words familiar to you as well?
That's the reason I asked you. How did you get over it?
That's the reason I asked you back. I think I think what's important with that is that as long as you or I, as long as the individual, as long as I knew I was trying, and you sort of walked out, and when you walk out to bat, your aim is to be successful. Whatever it looks like, that's the most important thing. And at the end of the career, if you can look back on the right sort of figures, then you must have got it right at some stage. I mean, what I had to do with, I have to say, I had to deal with many a time, more in county cricket than international cricket, because there was the accusation that, having come back from a test match, for instance, and I played a lot of test matches, so I had a lot of this where you come back from, say, Lords, Edgbaston, Headingley or somewhere, and you're immediately into a county match. Well, confession is this: there were times where my motivation was not 100%. And you hope, actually, the morning you get out of bed, you go to a ground, you have an hour and a half before you start the game. You hope that at some stage during that time, before the start of the game, your motivation levels come up, and when you wake up, you get over that sort of hangover, as it were, from the test match. But sometimes I was below par. So sometimes you get through it, you might make some runs. Sometimes you get out cheaply, and people look at you thinking, well, that looked, because it looks, as it were, easy. It looked easy when it went well, but it looked easy when it went badly. And people don't like it when it looks easy and it goes badly, because they make that natural assumption that it wasn't really it didn't really matter to you. And I had to deal with that quite a few times, especially, as I say, when I went back to Leicestershire, where, the members of the club, the fans of the club want you to do well. The club wants you to do well. Everyone wants you to do well. And believe it or not, I wanted to do well as well. But on those bad days, you sometimes had to deal with people who show their dissatisfaction. Sometimes they got that wrong. But it's a nice thing to have for most of the time, because here we are many, many years on from the end of the playing days. 93 was my last first class game. And when I interact with people, fans from that era, When I speak at dinners, you meet people who used to watch the game in those days or watch the videos. When they say nice things, then that's an approval. It's nice that people enjoyed the way it worked at the time. When they go for the cliche, oh, you used to nick at the second slip all the time, I have to try and force a smile on the face. You used to try and, okay, fine. And you think, well, okay, I'll just go along with the joke, or shall I point out that I made 8,231 test match runs at an average of 44 point something? In other words, it wasn't all bad. And you have that sort of choice to make as to how you react to people and how they react to you. But it is quite interesting in a way how people form a memory, and with the distance of time, that memory is either rose tinted, in which case it's lovely, or it's critical, in which case you think it's about time they got over it, because there have been 40 years of cricket since, and we're watching Buttler and Stokes and Bairstow and lots of people doing extraordinary things nowadays. That's the England side. And you think about the Indian side and the extraordinary talent there, and you think around the world, the extraordinary talent we watch when we're lucky enough to be in commentary boxes. And you think, well, actually move on and enjoy. Don't worry about when I nicked it to slip in 1985. Just let's move on. This is now 2022.
Fair enough. What made the golden-haired David Gard choose the whites on the field instead of a possible white wig in a courtroom?
The law career to which you allude was virtually stillborn. The simple truth is that I went to University College London, very good university, and a very strong law department, not with any real ambition. And let's face it, if you, in anything that you try and do in life, whatever you're trying to do, you need the drive and the ambition to make it work. So my drive and ambition was already switched very firmly towards cricket. I knew from a season and a half of largely second team county cricket that I quite enjoyed the lifestyle, that I loved the game. I was probably quite good at it. I didn't know anything about law. I didn't really have I'd lost that thing which you need, which is sort of the academic drive. I'd done the academic stuff up until the age of sort of 17, 18, and my life was changing. So in all honesty, my year at UCL was a waste of time. There was a guy, always tell the story fondly. One of my professors at UCL was a fellow called Professor Thomas. He taught Roman law, still don't understand it, but he was an MCC member, a cricket fan. So I used to see him in the long room. So in the next couple of years, I'd see him in the long room as I was walking out to bat, that sort of thing. We'd nod. And when my England career started and things started to go well, I saw him again. And there was a little nod, but this time we spoke. It was probably the first noted time we spoke to each other, actually, in 4 or 5 years properly. He said, I think you made the right decision. And I agree entirely. Here we are. Crikey, how many years on is it? 1975 that was. So we're a long way past that. I do ask people now and again, when I meet eminent lawyers nowadays, and here I am, having enjoyed my playing career, having enjoyed my career in the media, having loved all that, having made the most of that, I think. But with things calming down a bit nowadays, I sort of tend to ask lawyers I meet, do you think there's any chance I can come back to it at the age of 65? Do you think it's too late? And of course, the obvious answer is, you must be joking. And I am.
Your impish sense of humor made the administrator see red at times, didn't it?
Well, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because whether it's impish or insolent or revolutionary or, I don't know, there were too many good moments to miss. And some of those stories are well listed. I've written about them with tongue in cheek and a smile on my face, if you can do both at the same time. There were times where, yes, there were moments of humor, but I was playing with people like Ian Botham and Alan Lamb. And in summary of their characters, they were never going to die wondering what might have been, because if there was an opportunity to make runs, take wickets, play cricket, have fun, go out of an evening, go and do something special, we would all do it, because that was the era where you were kind of allowed to do it. Nowadays, it seems as though things are much more restrained, constrained. Things are so much busier. For international players, for instance, you go from international game to international game, hardly anything else, it seems, in between. So the pressure is on in a very different way. We had times where, we could do things just differently. For instance, thinking of India, for instance, our tours of India in the 80s, they were 4 months long. The longest tour I've seen England do to India in the last 20 years, about a month and a half. And it's all internationals. We had 4 months. We covered the country. We experienced different cities. We experienced everything. One of my loves, you will know, is wildlife. So we got taken to tiger reserves. You would get on the train in Kolkata, end up in the middle of India somewhere, say Kana, with Bob and Anne Wright, and we'd be in jeeps and on the back of elephants an hour later. So all those things become beautiful memories. That's not revolutionary as such. That's just making the most of opportunities, which is the way I would describe it. And it meant that, for instance, touring in those days, whether you're in India or Australia, West Indies is a bit different because we just lost there. That was the balance of power in the 80s. But you could still enjoy the Caribbean culture. You could still enjoy the cultures, the different things going on in the different countries, because you had a bit more time to look at it. Whereas nowadays, I suspect it's a little bit more sterile. The world is not as different across the world as it used to be, but players are basically going from an airport to a hotel to a ground, and that's all they see most of the time. I think the opportunities to get out and experience things out and about in these very, very different countries are now fewer than they used to be.
You mentioned Alan Lamb, Ian Botham. The three of you, for some reason, did not really sort of agree with the Gooch Stewart style of management.
There is a sort of golden rule, I think, when cricket teams evolve, and it's the same actually across lots of sports. When cricket teams evolve specifically, you have a time where a team needs that light touch, and a time where a team needs someone stern and disciplinarian to take it by the scruff of the neck and put it back into shape again. So in recent times, since our days, or relatively recent times, because these people are now in the media and watching as we have done for so long. But if you take, for instance, one of the great examples for me as an observer was the change when Nasser Hussain was England captain and Michael Vaughan took over. Because Nasser was a very, very driven leader. Slightly volatile temperament, which you'll have to admit to. In his early days at Essex, there were far too many little explosions for his teammates to be entirely comfortable alongside him. But he was a very, very good, driven England captain. And what he did to his England team for 2 or 3 years was sort of grab it by the scruff of the neck, shake it into shape, put it into shape, and make it tougher. And so when he realized, and he's always been very open about this, which I respect a lot, when he realized that he was losing command of that dressing room and the attitudes were changing, he stepped down, and Michael Vaughan inherited a team that now knew what it was doing by and large, but just needed now to be given that lighter touch, needed to be allowed a bit more of a free rein to express itself and win games. So Michael did the right thing because he managed to sort of change the culture, and yet you kept the ability, you kept the confidence, you kept the ability to win games. He was a good captain as much as he knew which levers to pull and when. So he got the benefit of Hussein's discipline, and then moved that team on into a higher place, able to win the Ashes in 2005, famously. And there you are. But then, of course, 2 or 3 years down the line, a couple of years down the line, again, things change. So a different leadership has to come in. So going back to my era, well, my time as captain was a gentler time, inclusive. I mean, one of my great rules, as I say, was to include people in discussions. Each and every member of a squad or a team, to me, had the right to come to me and say whatever he wanted, make suggestions, ask questions. And we had that. I tried to maintain that sort of communication if I at all could, but it's never possible to do it 100% of the time. But I wanted people to feel they could at least come and talk. When Graham took over, things had slipped a bit. Yes, so we'd lost an Ashes series, and no one in England ever likes losing an Ashes series. But he'd lost it very badly too. So it was Graham's turn to go back to the disciplinarian style. And with Mickey Stewart, who was old style, committed, very committed. I mean, I sometimes feel I sort of did Mickey down a little bit too much. He was a very committed character, desperate to see England win, but his principles were formed in the 1960s probably. But a very, very good man underneath it all, and very determined to try and do his bit to help the equation. But between him and Graham, for instance, there was this less inclusive, I would say, regime where players, and at least I was still playing, which is something, but players, we were told what to do. There was less of that exchange of opinions. I mean, I therefore had to cast myself as the rebel once or twice, because there were things, that thing I alluded to, there were things where, some of us would talk to each other and we wouldn't be happy with the way things are being run. So you'd say, well, okay, I as a sort of senior player then had that task of somehow transmitting this to Graham, but you stand up in front of the team and say, look, well, can I ask you about this? Because I don't think this is quite right. The way things were, the way we were training, the way we were practicing, the way this, the communication was lacking. But if you don't get backed up, you then become an isolated figure. Therefore, you become cast as the rebel. And then, things go back to where they were, and you have to live with it. And you have to sort of be your individual self as best you can and make your runs and take your catches and just try and fit in. But there was definitely a sort of a difference of opinion. We had different philosophers at the time, and it ended up. I mean, it's in wisdom. It ended up with me losing my place. I then lost my own sort of confidence, my fluency, and for a year and a half, I was out of international cricket, which I missed dreadfully. But I wasn't playing. I mean, the one thing I have to admit about that, I wasn't playing well enough to be part of it. When I did come back in, I then had to work in a very different way to make sure I contributed as I wanted to fit into that team.
You spoke briefly about the upcoming semi-final. Where do you see, if at all, you see any chink in the Indian armour?
Well, the other thing I'd say is that one of the things I've learned in whatever it is now, sort of best part of, 30 odd years of trying to predict cricket matches. And if you go back to what we started talking about earlier, McCullum-Stokes regime with test matches, we should have lost half those test matches last summer in the UK. We should have lost to India. When I was, I saw you in Mumbai at the time, when the chase started in the fourth innings of that game at Edgbaston, I genuinely, and I think everyone felt that India had the advantage. So that chase, in a sense, was ridiculous. It should never have happened. England could have made a good fist of it, could have made it interesting, but they shouldn't really have won the game. And yet it was their positivity, that Stokes-McCullum positivity, that somehow gave them the right balance to battle through the tough times at the start of the innings, then to take command and then make it look easy. So predicting games of cricket is now impossible. Predicting games of cricket in things like World T20s, you're an absolute idiot if you're going to say with 100% certainty that side A or side B is going to win their semi-final, because we've seen, what have we seen already in the Super 12s? We've seen that ridiculous game where Virat Kohli beat Pakistan single-handedly, when Pakistan seemed to have the absolute upper hand for 80% of the game. We've seen Zimbabwe win games. We've seen turnarounds. We've seen South Africa booted out of the competition, when they've got a very good side, and yet they just implode on one day, and that's it. That's their Super 12's done. They're not in the semi-finals. So trying to say with any certainty who's going to win these semi-finals, let alone the final, it's an absolute guessing game, because we know full well that each of the four sides involved have special players. This is it's an extraordinary era for talent around the world. And of course, what I love about the current punditry thing is that things like names are now being superseded by initials. I keep looking onto Cricinfo to sort of keep an eye on what's going on in between. And I keep seeing Sky, SKY, and I keep thinking, well, what's Sky TV got to do with it? But no, it's some extraordinarily talented batsman who just happens to be called Surya Kumar Yadav, who is now called Sky, SKY. And I know this, of course, from Bollywood. You can't be bothered with names; you have to have initials, and it becomes a code. It becomes people become there was a time when people became known by one name. Now it's initials. Now it's these codes. But we're talking about sides where people like SKY can change games. Virat Kohli, nice to see him back in that sort of form where he can justify his immense talent and win games. But England had this. Had Stokes back in some sort of form in that final game in the Super 12, showing that he has a role to play, having had a poor tournament up until then. You've got Buttler, who, as I said earlier, is one of the most extraordinary one-day players you will ever see in your life. You've got Pakistan with Shaheen Shah Afridi. You've got New Zealand, who are always good, because New Zealand, even if you can't sort of identify their players sometimes, which is sort of generality over the last 30, 40 years. And that's unfair because they have some very, very good players. So the bolts out of the axis. Williamson, who has been one of the top 4 batsmen in the world for the last decade. You got some extraordinary players there, and a team spirit, which makes them yet stronger. So let's face it, any one of those 4 teams could end up holding that trophy by the time these next 3 games are done.
You were leading me into this next question. You brought in Sky Sports. The association with them ended rather abruptly, would you say?
Well, not really. To be fair to them, the communication a couple of years ahead of my final game for them was that they wouldn't be renewing the contract at the end of that summer of 2019. I then, because I loved working for them and loved the role I had there, and just it was the dream job for 20 years. I then did my best to try and persuade them to change their minds. Sky are not very good at changing minds. I mean, they have a way of making decisions which they're entitled to have. Let's face it. Things like TV nowadays, there is a look that is now global. If you look at sport across the world, the blend, the diversity, it's everywhere, and that was part of that process. So something has to give. And I'd always known, for instance, when you spend 20 years working for that same TV company, and you see, for instance, people like my great friend Bob Willis, the late great Bob Willis. Bob was very much at the top of the tree in the early days, one of their lead commentators, an extraordinarily good pundit, very hard-hitting, very open, very honest. And yet, when, for instance, Michael Atherton, Nasser Hussain, again, 2 very good commentators, very good pundits, came into the mix, someone had to go. So Bob went a bit sideways and found a niche elsewhere, still worked for Sky for many years. So there was always that process. I always had this feeling that maybe as the presenter, and having watched people like Richie Benaud, and I don't want to put myself in his league, Richie was outstanding, but having watched people like Richie go on into his 70s, 80s, sort of the veneration that he was always held in, I thought, well, maybe I might just get away with this because I am the man who, hi, good morning, welcome, and you can talk to the younger pundits and just steer them through. But unfortunately, the trends went beyond that. So it was well forecast. I mean, we all knew it was going to happen. Ian Botham was in the same boat at the same time, and we both felt that we'd like to carry on. I think Ian is, of course, Ian's gone into wine trade. He makes his own wines nowadays, and I think he's doing very well with that. I'm still trying to find work where I can as a commentator, and still sort of stay around the game as much as I can. But yeah, the only thing that I found disappointing, to be honest, was that towards the end there were 1 or 2 mishaps. I really wanted my final summer at Sky to be, as it were, triumphant. I put everything into that series against Australia. Felt my commentary I thought was good. The presentation was good. There was the odd hiccup here and there, and it was interesting because outside of the work we were doing, there was some very nice accolades passed on. In the press, the media sort of recognised this as 20 years, the end of a sort of era. Gower and Botham leaving the commentary box. We'd helped Sky become what Sky was. We'd been hired because we were big enough names at the start of it all, and when Sky was starting, they wanted the big names, if they could possibly get them, to make it attractive. So by the time we'd finished, of course, things are very different. Budgets are different, actually. That's another thing. Let's face it. It seems there's a big squeeze virtually everywhere nowadays on production budgets. But it was just disappointing that it didn't quite finish in the right spirit. That's probably as much as I should say about it. And of course, nowadays, if I go and work somewhere where it's not Sky producing the cricket, but they're taking it, somehow I end up on Sky. One of the things that amuses me nowadays is that even good friends who don't seem to understand it quite say, "Oh, you're working for Sky again." No, I'm working for someone else. It's just that Sky have bought production. You bought the rights for the UK. So it is fun to be back, even inadvertently. But the important thing for me is that, having sort of been so involved in this game for so long, the important thing for me is that, I like the people, I like the game, I like everything I've done for 40 odd years in the game. And I don't really want to let that go. So whatever opportunities there are, I will just take them as best I can.
Of course, you'll have a lot of opportunity. Now, talking of Botham, what was it handling a supremely confident and match-winning personality that he was?
Good one. Interesting one, actually, because Ian, you mentioned Michael Brearley earlier. Ian and Brearley had a very good relationship, partly because Mike was very much the senior partner in that partnership. And because Ian in those days was confident, he was brilliant, but he was more malleable, as it were. So he was more prepared to take advice from Brearley. But it was great playing in that era because, for instance, that Ashes of '81, which made Ian's reputation forever. It was an extraordinary series, brilliant series, and Ian was outstanding during that series. And he did lots of other things, of course, for the next 10, 15 years around the world. But when you have to captain him, say, how much later was it? Almost 10 years later. Well, you've got a slightly different animal. And my decision or my conundrum was this. You had a potential match winner. You had a free spirit. Now, one of my things, apart from that inclusivity idea of getting people to talk to you and keeping that communication open, one of my other principles is you've got a free spirit like both. You shackle it at your own peril. So I had to sometimes allow Ian what was deemed to be too much space, too much free rein. And it didn't always go down well with other players because you had to sort of try and keep other players on a different sort of regime. So trying to mix and match is a really tricky thing to do. But I didn't want to make Ian just be one, just another player. To get the best out of Ian, he needs to be that free spirit. Now, I got a bit of the best. I got a bit of the worst, actually, at times. And the only time, there's one time in the Caribbean where we were coming second by a distance again, where he wasn't really doing the right things. And we almost dropped him. But that would have seemed sort of like, well, cutting your nose off to spite your face. It was, it was going to be a tricky thing to do. And I just had one of the briefest ever conversations between a captain and the player. I said, look, I just want you to know we nearly dropped you. And I can't imagine there was ever a time where an England captain with an Ian Botham in his squad was going to say, we're not going to play him. Maybe right towards the end of his long career, there were other reasons to do so. But when he was in the middle of his career like that, he was potentially he's just an important man. So, I mean, for instance, if you put it into context, the previous summer, 1985, we'd beaten Australia in the Ashes, Alan Border's team, and Ian had been really very much at the forefront of that victory. He'd played a full part in it as an all-rounder. When we got to the Caribbean, barely 4 months later, suddenly it wasn't going so well. West Indies were the strongest side in the world. He was opening the bowling, trying to be the fast bowler, and asking for 3 flips and 2 dollars in the short leg. And Gordon Greenwich and Desmond Haynes were battering it past me at cover for 4 every other ball. And I got that slightly wrong. So we had to had to sort of have that word. Now, that was one of the most interesting times for me because, I've been friends with Ian. I played with him for a long, long time. We've done all sorts of things together on and off the field. And that's where you're tested as a captain because that, say, of a squad of 16, people are looking at you. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to give him too much? Are you just going to forget it, pretend it's not happening? Or are you going to have a serious word? So I'm afraid to say that even though Ian got the message and changed his ways slightly after that, West Indies being what they were, the finest all-round team of that era in the 80s, the results didn't change much. That, I'm afraid, is one of those truisms of the game. When you come up against sides like that, you have to play, as it were, twice as well as you possibly can or normally can to get anywhere.
The Caribbean islands those days were spots for touring, not for playing cricket, David. I know that.
Well,
I can't fault you on that.
I mean, the joke is that because they were so dominant, it seems we went back to the original system of 3-day test matches rather inadvertently, which allowed us more time to be tourists as well as cricketers. But of course, that's not what the English public were really hoping for.
Christmas is around the corner. Your wine collection is getting bolstered.
Well, that's an up and down thing. Yeah, I mean, Ian is making wine, as I said to you earlier, and making some quite good stuff. Actually, he's very good at it. He knows his thing. My interest in the wine trade has been a little bit of ambassadorial work here and there, largely as a man who enjoys some of the finer things. So yes, we will not be dry. Let's put it that way. There will be. I should be back from my work in time for Christmas. It's a family thing. I have two daughters who quite like a glass of wine as well. They were brought up on the good stuff, so they'll complain if they're given anything too cheap and nasty. That is for sure. But to be honest, don't tell anyone. To be honest, we don't have to wait for Christmas and birthdays to enjoy a nice glass of wine.
So I'm not a wine drinker, but I agree with you because you are definitely a connoisseur of wine. And finally, David, you are on a tour with the England side. You got now. There's airfield close by. There's a tiger moth available for lease. Are you going to rent it again?
Well, the original incident was 1991. That was the Graham Gooch tour, which wasn't going quite so well. I have at home here a dozen cartoons reflecting the incident. Fondly. It's a story which I've been asked to tell many a time at dinners, at functions, by people who sort of were aware of it at the time. It was, in all seriousness, a bit of a turning point for me, but it was one of those things I don't regret because it was me. It was something which just instinctively I felt had to be done. It certainly wasn't as difficult as climbing Everest. It certainly wasn't. I mean, in my book, it shouldn't have offended. It should have amused. Maybe a sort of a bit of a chuckle, but come on, we're trying to do things differently. A different reaction to the one we had, which was a very stern one. But that was the time. That was the era. And I went back with Sky. Oh, when's the last time? I don't know. So 10, 12 years ago now, probably. And we recreated the same thing. This time with cameras on the plane everywhere. So we had a tiger moth, same sort of vintage, 1940-ish. Different airstrip, different pilot, really cool dude flying this thing. And this time we did all the aerobatics with cameras in my face, cameras on the edge, on the wings. So you could see the plane doing its loop-the-loop, its barrel rolls. You can see, and I was trying desperately to keep my face under control because you've got an open cockpit. And so, as you're going up and down, your face does things all by itself. So trying to keep my face under control while we did these aerobatics. Lovely thing to do. Recreated the incident. The other time I did it, actually, I once did a couple of shows for the BBC. They had a series on airplanes. Called, it had a series on flying. I did a few films, including a tiger moth in Kent on a glorious day with a lovely pilot. So it's actually brought me a lot of pleasure. As well as the odd problem, the odd fine and losing your place for a couple of years, for 18 months, all that's minor stuff. It's brought me a lot of pleasure over the time since. And if someone said to me tomorrow, well, actually not tomorrow, the weather's terrible here, but if someone said to me next summer, do you fancy going to tiger moth? I said, of course I do. Absolutely. Anytime you like. But I'll tell you, here's one for you though. The one thing I would love to do is one of the flights you can do in the UK now in the back of a World War II Spitfire. So they've got the two-seater Spitfires. There's a couple of airfields that do these things regularly. It costs quite a bit, but it would be something I would absolutely love to do. One of the most historic planes in our history, the most extraordinary craft, and the most brilliant sound. I mean, if you like cars or planes in this rather more sort of homogeneous era where everything looks the same, sounds the same. If you've got an old petrol engine and the Merlin engines of the original Spitfires made this extraordinary noise. I mean, that's one of my bucket list things. That's one of my ambitions, whatever else happens in the closing years of this life of mine. While I can still enjoy it, I will go and do that.
Of course, I'm sure you'll do that and you'll enjoy it as well. Now, talking about the 91 tour of Australia, was that the tour you met somebody called David Vengsarkar there?
The doppelgangers. The other David Gower was in New Zealand.
Was it? Okay.
I mean, there are plenty of. I'm sure there are plenty of them out there. But this was one who just happened to be a cricket fan. And the, the slightly tricky thing was, we would communicate, all very friendly. And every time I've been to New Zealand, I mean, I haven't been there for a long time actually, but we would sort of somehow meet up. And we had this. We'd finished in Australia that tour, and we went to New Zealand, I think, for 3 one-days. Now, the other day, Gower sort of said, well, it'd be nice to catch up, to come and say hi. And Graham Gooch, as my captain, had said, right, we've had a below par tour of Australia. We got to finish off this tour in New Zealand. I don't want this to be just a damp squib. We've got to try our hardest. So when we first get there, we need to get out and train and practice and really sort of just put everything into trying to win these 3 games. And on day 1, as we were in Christchurch at the old Lancaster Park ground. We're trotting around the ground, and I see this fella who's just walked into the stadium. I think well, I don't want to be rude to him, so I'll just break off quickly, say hi, try and explain to him that we are in training. It's just the start of the last couple of weeks of a tour where we need to get in. But the fact that I sort of peeled off and just shook his hand and said, "Look, I'll be right back with you. Give us, hang around for a while. I'll see you in a moment," was enough to enrage my captain. So, poor old Gucci sort of went, he flew into not quite a rage, but there was a sort of there was an issue which we had to try and sort out, all on the back of this, someone just having the same name as me. But as I say, if you look through the phone directories, that's a bit old-fashioned. But if you look through the lists of names around the world, I'm sure there are plenty more.
Anyway, thanks a lot, David. Thanks for your time. And as usual, it was engaging talking to you. It was enthralling as well. Thanks for your time once again.
Absolutely my pleasure.
That was David Gower, as usual, exuding class, and the way he speaks is always enchanting and enthralling. As I always say, you can watch all the earlier episodes on the handles of the Hindu and Sports Star. For those who are joining us for the first time, we would like to subscribe for this channel and also press the like button, and keep coming with your comments regularly, because we are very keen to know as to what you think of the stuff that we dish out for you, and also what it is that you'd like to see in the future as well. So until I join you in a week's time, take care and be safe.